Hi, I'm Lewis Porter, and you're watching The Jazz Musician's Voice.
Hello, my name is Jonah Jonathan, and welcome once again to The Jazz Musician's Voice. Today I've had the wonderful opportunity of interviewing jazz pianist, composer, educator, and historian and researcher Dr. Lewis Porter out of Brandeis University. He's got a PhD and really a genius of a cat. I study with him at Rutgers University in the Jazz History and Research program. And Lewis Porter is a really interesting guy. I mean, he's a wonderful pianist. He's worked with some of the top names in jazz, including Ravi Coltrane, Dave Liebman, and many others. I mean, he's just one of the go-to pianists. And he's also a wonderful educator and historian. He's written several books, including one on John Coltrane, his life and the music, and one on Lester Young, and quite a few others, and he's really one of the top resources if you're looking into jazz history. And we talk about his life and some of his concepts, and it's really probably part one of many interviews that we'll do, because Lewis Porter has so many interesting things to talk about. But please check out this whole interview and stay tuned for future things that'll be coming up. Some really exciting projects, so we hope you check those things out. And thanks for watching The Jazz Musician's Voice. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today I have the wonderful opportunity to interview a really great friend and mentor and teacher of mine, Lewis Porter, great jazz pianist, Dr. Lewis Porter, jazz historian and educator, and composer, jack of all trades. You've done quite a lot. So, Dr. Porter, for people who are not familiar with your background, could you tell us a little bit about where you're from and then how you got involved in music?
Well, I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but my family moved when I was an infant. I was maybe 6 months. And at that point, my father was working in clothing factories. He was a mechanical engineer and just had to move around for those gigs. So first we moved to Minneapolis. Then by the time I was 2, we moved to a suburb of Atlanta. And it's funny because people always think of me as the quintessential New Yorker, but the truth is we lived in Atlanta till I was 6 and a half. I went to kindergarten there. I went to the first half of first grade, and I loved it there.
Interesting,
Yeah. So people they never guess that, they never say, well, you seem like you're from the South,
Yeah.
That's not exactly what you would think,
Mm-hmm.
So, but when I was 3, my folks got divorced, and we stayed in Atlanta. But when I was 6 and a half, my mom took myself and my older and younger brother, and we moved to New York, and because that's where her parents were, and they were helping her out. So from that point on, I lived in the Bronx. So the short answer I always tell people is I'm from the Bronx, but it's really a little more complicated.
Sure. Well, so tell us a little bit about how you got involved in music, from the Bronx. I mean, I'm sure you started taking piano lessons at some point, right?
Well, it's funny because I kind of just started to love music, and before I even played an instrument, my older brother got interested in classical music and used to read up what are the best classical LPs, and he would come home and say, this is supposed to be a great performance of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, And I went crazy. I just loved that music so much that I used to this is a true story, I used to physically, when I was like 7 years old, used to physically roll on the floor, like when he was going da-dun, da-dun, dun, dun, and I would go rum, brum, bum, bum on the floor,
Yeah.
And I went crazy. By the time I was 10, I decided I was definitely going to devote my life to music. But by that time, pretty much the only music I knew was classical music. And it was only around that same time that I started to play an instrument. We did have an upright piano in the house. My folks were not musicians, but my mom was an amateur pianist. She had piano lessons when she was a kid, and she liked to play, once in a blue moon, she liked to take out like songs from South Pacific. and she knew how to read. She would read through them, you know. So at that point, though, once in a while I'd go touch the piano, but I wasn't really trying to play an instrument, and my brother was taking piano lessons. So my mom, being divorced, asked him, being the older boy, she said, "What I want everyone to take music lessons, good middle class family, and it's middle class Jewish family, that's very important. What do you think Louis should take?" And he said, "What about violin?" She said, "Okay." So I started violin lessons. My teacher said I was doing great, but just started to lose interest in the violin. And to tell you the truth, I got sick of holding it up under my chin.
Yeah.
And if there's one proof that you're not a natural violin player, it's if you can't stand holding it up with your chin, because if you don't like doing that, you're not a natural violin player.
Sure.
So I started to gravitate towards the piano, and what happened is I gravitated towards the piano, and my brother's piano teacher saw me fooling around. And I didn't know this, but my mom came up to me later and she said, "Your brother's piano teacher wants to teach you." I said, "Why?" She said, "She saw you fooling around." She said, "That's the one with the talent." My brother wasn't too thrilled about this,
Yeah.
but that's what she said. I didn't know she had said that. But the thing is, she was a very strict German woman. Like when my brother had his lessons, all you could hear was "no, no, no," and you could hear like that.
Oh, wow.
And I said to my mom, "I don't think I want piano lessons." And when you're a kid, you don't realize different teachers are different. I thought that's piano lessons, somebody yelling at you and slapping your hand. So I said, forget it. So I taught myself, or whatever teaching yourself means. And when I started around that time, so this would be around 12, I started to hear jazz. And one of the main places I heard it, and it's funny because I've since met other musicians that said this, was on a TV show called Peter Gunn. Peter Gunn was a detective. It was a half-an-hour show. But the thing is, jazz ran continuously from the beginning of the show to the end. They had a jazz soundtrack. There were no silent moments. And when it wasn't on the soundtrack, his home base, where he used to hang out and get his instructions, what he had to do, was a jazz club. And so sometimes the musician, you'd hear music in the background, then he'd go down the steps, you'd see musicians playing on screen. I didn't know at the time, but I found out later. You can see some of those episodes online now, and you can buy them in DVDs. It's Shelly Manne and Shorty Rogers and Jack Sheldon. It was well-known West Coast musicians, And I loved that music. So I was starting to get interested in jazz, but I didn't realize yet what it was. And then when I was 14, I heard the album Stan Getz with Gilberto and Joe Bim. And his saxophone playing on that album, I still think, is some of the best saxophone playing I ever heard. But at that age, I was so excited about his saxophone playing that day, I remember the album we had ordered in the mail. I listened to the album. My brother came home after me, and he said, "What are you listening to?" I said, I keep listening to this album. I heard the first side, the second side. I went right back to the first side. I can't stop listening to this. I said, "Stan Getz is the name of the saxophone player." He said, "Yeah." I said, "What kind of music is that?" He said, he was a good big one for looking things up. He said, "Let me look it up." So he looked in the Schwann catalog. He said, "Let's see, he's not here. Oh, here it is under jazz." I said, "That's the music for me, is jazz." And from that day, it was like what they call an epiphany. I already knew from 10 I wanted to be a musician, and from 14, I knew I wanted to be a jazz musician.
Wow, that's really great. I've always found that us jazz musicians, it's a calling, really, and each person always finds some moment or experience that turns them on to the music and really makes them figure out that's what I want to do.
It's true, and it's a good point, because people say to me, "Why did you decide?" I don't know why. I don't know why that music from Peter Gunn, and then especially that Stan Getz soloing, made me decide I was going to devote my life to that. I don't know why. I just know when and how. But why is, like you say, it's a bit of a mystery.
Well, it's the jazz bug.
It's the jazz bug, yeah.
So, growing up in the Bronx, I'm sure you were exposed to some jazz gigs, right? At some point, you got a chance to go out and see some music.
Absolutely. And what happened is, by the time I was 15, I started going regularly to jazz performances in Manhattan, mostly in the Village, but not only. And one of the main things that I used to do is on Sunday afternoons, there was an organization called Jazz Interactions, and they used to have concerts at a place called the Red Garter, which I understand is the same location that later became the Bottom Line, which is 4th Street, a couple, like a block over from Broadway, I think 4th and Mercer, and now it's an NYU building. And at the Red Garter, the funny thing is it was like a Dixieland club, but on Sunday afternoons, Jazz Interactions would have concerts. It could be anybody. So I saw Jimmy Jeffrey and Bob Brookmeyer with a bass and drum. I think it might have been Reggie Workman on bass, like just a really interesting combination. Yeah. I saw Dave Liebman and Randy Brecker when they were like 18 and 19. You know, Dave remembers this gig. I asked him about it. Ray Gallen was on piano, I think. So I saw a lot of great stuff in that series. There's a little bit of a funny story I'll tell you real quick, which is it was only $2, but we were poor. Remember, my folks were divorced when I was 3, and my mom was raised to be a housewife. I mean, now she had to go out and work, and we were with babysitters. You know, it wasn't easy. The 4 of us, myself and my 3 brothers, for a long time lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. So my mom slept on a couch in the living room. We shared the bedroom. I mean, this was rough. So even $2, if I didn't have to spend it, it would have been nice. So on WKCR radio, and this is before Phil Schaap was in college, because he's about my age, when I was 15, they used to have a contest. Every Sunday night, they would say, if you can identify who, like a blindfold test, if you can identify who the musicians are on this record, or they would pick, like one week it would be the piano player, you had to identify, another time the drummer. You'll get a free ticket to see next Sunday afternoon's concert. I won practically all the time. In fact, I won something like 9 weeks in a row.
Wow.
And the 10th, and I remember the guy was impressed, because I would even say, well, I've never heard that record before, but that's got to be Elvin Jones on drums. He'd say, that's right. Or I'd say, I've never heard that one before, but it's Wynton Kelly. It didn't have to be a record that I heard. So that's, that shows that I was starting to get the kind of ear that somebody like you or jazz musicians have, where you recognize someone by their style, not just because you've heard the record before,
Sure.
So he was impressed. He said, you're 15 and you know all this? I said, well, I already loved jazz so much, and I was just listening. I used to listen to the radio and take notes, anything that sounded good. I still have some of my notes that say, oh, don't forget Joe Henderson. I remember making a note. And Duke Pearson and Joe Henderson played great on some of his records. And so the 10th week, he said, whatever the answer was, I think it might have been Phil Woods. He said, that's right, but I can't give you the ticket. I said, why not? Because other people are complaining. They say, how can you give the ticket to the same guy every week? So I said, all right, I guess that's the end of that.
Yeah, so wow, that's that's the early background of Lewis Porter's jazz historiography, because in our classes at Rutgers, I'm a student of yours in the master's program at Rutgers, we take notes on this music, and we listen to a lot of music, and we focus on learning those techniques and learning the style of someone, and taking those notes. So it's interesting to hear the how that kind of got started, Lewis Porter's ear listening.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but it is kind of the same idea, that my experience even back then is that if you hear a solo you really like, then a week later or 2 weeks later you're with your friend, you say, oh, I want you to hear this really great solo, and you never can remember exactly where it was. So I think it was the 3rd cut, but I don't remember exactly. So it does help to make your notes, and I'm sure that was, without my thinking about it, that was the beginning of my being a historian of sorts,
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about high school and college. Where'd you go to school, and how did you continue your career in music?
So what happened is my mom was against my becoming a musician. She said, well, that's just what I need. I'm divorced. I have 3 boys. I'm the middle one. And now you're going to be a bum out on the street, and you won't have any, I'm going to have to support you for the rest of my life. So she was totally against it. And she insisted that we all go to the Bronx High School of Science. And we were good students. I was an excellent student. And So you had to get in. That wasn't to this day, I'm sure they still have. They had an entrance exam, even though it's a public high school. It's a selective public high school. And it was a great education, don't get me wrong, but I wasn't happy there. I wasn't happy there. And it wasn't until my senior year that I met other kids who were into jazz. And I really didn't enjoy it, but I had a good education.
That's an interesting school, you know. Just the founder of what was it? I believe Tumblr or one of the websites went to Bronx School of Science and didn't like it and dropped out of school and became a billionaire.
Oh my God, is that right? That's
So
interesting.
it seems like
Wow.
a breeding ground for some pretty successful people, you know.
I guess so. I do meet people from there every now and then. They're mostly doing interesting things. And but we did arrange for a compromise when I went to college. It had to be a college in New York State because I had won a New York State Regents scholarship, and those are only good in New York State colleges. And my mom didn't have much money, so she said, well, it has to be in New York. But I said, well, how about this? And she said, no way, you're being a music major. I said, well, how about this? How about if I go to the University of Rochester? I'll major in whatever. I'll think about it. I have interests in other things, but I can study music because the Eastman School of Music is part of that college, you know. So that was our compromise, and I would say it worked out okay. I mean, it would have been probably better to be a music major, but I did finally, for the first time, have a year of formal piano lessons, because up to then I was still teaching myself on the piano. And I was in a combo for a semester that was directed by Chuck Mangione, the trumpeter composer, you know. And it's funny because to this day, you know, people know I wrote a book about Train. And I stand up for Chuck Mangione, you know, and people say, well, how can you be into Train and Chuck Mangione? He's like the, what do you call it, the smooth jazz king, you know.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is when I knew him, which was the fall of '71, was just before he was into smooth jazz. And if you listen to any of his old records on Riverside, he was even with Art Blakey in '66, the same band when Keith Jarrett was on piano. So if you listen to him back then, he was actually a protege of Dizzy Gillespie. He had gotten from Dizzy, you know, Dizzy gave John Faddis one too, like his special trumpet.
Yeah,
Chuck was one of the cats who had one of those Dizzy trumpets that he got from Dizzy. And he was playing very hardcore jazz. He sounded great, but even better, he was a really good teacher. He was just a terrific teacher, very supportive. I could tell you some funny stories, things that happened. It would be a little long, so maybe we'll save those. But the bottom line is I had a very good experience with him, and he was a terrific teacher. So I do stand up for Chuck Mangione.
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, University of Rochester, you know, Eastman over there, it was a very vibrant scene, I'm sure. You know, a lot of cats tell me about that, you know, that area, you know, especially like even Ron Carter told me about his time at Eastman.
That's right.
And, you know, playing the frat parties and the various things out there. Were there a lot of clubs in the area that you were able to perform at?
I performed mostly on campus and then a couple times at off-campus parties. But there was one club in particular, there were two clubs that had really good jazz. One was a club, it was kind of in an African-American neighborhood of town, and I could almost think of the name of it. I bet if I looked it up, I'd recognize it. And I went there because a friend of mine who was a amateur guitarist, and his name is Don Buck, good guy, and he said, oh, I heard there's this really great guitar player. I think it was called Duffy's, this club.
You know, that's interesting because when Aj Allen Gums was mentioning a place that he used to go to,
Is
a
that
really
right?
nice jazz club in Rochester, so
Maybe this one. I think it was Duffy's. So I said, let's go. He said, there's this really great guitar player in town. Everyone's been raving about him. Let's go check him out. This would have been around 1969. It turned out it was Pat Martino. Boy,
Wow.
he played amazing. And he was with Gene Ludwig's trio. Gene Ludwig was an organist. He only passed away a couple years ago. Nice man. And the drummer, I don't remember, and Pat Martino, just the three of them. And Pat, the truth is, a lot of people already knew about Pat. He'd already made records on Prestige, but he wasn't yet that well known. So we were knocked out by him. And then who sat in but Chuck Mangione? He played great. And even my friends said, wow, this guy is great, because he was playing kind of Clark Terry type of stuff that night. The other club, I don't remember the name of it. It was more midtown, like a downtown club. And I saw that's where they had some big names, and I got to see Sonny Stitt, which was great. And there was this young saxophone player, white guy, who kept saying, "Let me sit in. You know, I'd love to sit in." Or he was a little aggressive about it, as I recall. And this was in between sets. You know, I was kind of taking it in. And finally, Sonny Stitt said, "Okay, the last number of the night." Typical Sonny Stitt style. He always used to, apparently, when people asked to sit in, he'd give them something hard to do. So he did Cherokee at a very fast tempo. Guess what? It was Jerry Nywood, and he played great. And in fact, I remember thinking at the time, say, gee, this guy's even better than Sonny Stitt. So Jerry was a great player, and of course, he was a Rochester person. You know, he was one of the cats from around town.
Sure, sure. Wow. So, what did you end up majoring in?
So what I decided to do was a
school?
psych major. I considered a few different things and finally ended up with a psych major. I also took enough philosophy that I could have been a philosophy minor, but I never made that official. And took enough music that I obviously could have been a music minor. But psych was my official major. And I did consider in later years that maybe I could do something in psych and that could be my day gig, as we say in music, you know. So I actually, I freelanced after college for a few years, I would say 4 years, as a piano player. And around that time, I took up sax as a double. And I was just starting to do some freelancing on sax, on alto as well. And then in 75, 76, I took a 1-year program to get a master's in psychology. It was an MED in counseling, which I did at Northeastern University right there in Boston. And what happened is I had moved to Boston. I was dating a lady that I met in Boston. Mm-hmm. She was from Harlem, actually. She was an African-American lady from Harlem. But she had gone to Wellesley, and all her college friends lived in the Boston area, and she wanted to move back up there. And I said, okay. You know, it's when you're young sometimes, it's like, all right,
move, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter, you know. Now to move would be like, oh my God, you know. But so I ended up being in Boston from 74 to 86, and that's where things really started to happen for me. It just turned out that way because, first of all, I freelanced a little, and you know, I said, well, maybe I need a day gig. So I got this master's in counseling. But the next thing, and I started to work. I worked with juvenile delinquents. I worked at a halfway house for recovering drug addicts. They were both really tough jobs. I'm not going to kid you.
Yeah.
They were very tough jobs. Like, I probably should have started with something easy, you know.
I know exactly what you're talking about. You know, I worked as a teacher's assistant at a juvenile detention school.
Okay,
so,
yeah, this was a day school for juvenile delinquents.
Yeah.
These were very tough jobs. So they probably weren't the best in terms of making me feel, wow, this is the field for me, you know. I learned, don't get me wrong, I learned a lot. It was a great growth experience, but it wasn't like fun, you know.
Yeah.
And it just happened around that time. All of a sudden, things started to happen for me in the music, to the point where from January 77 to today, I've only worked in the jazz field as an educator and as a performer. So just things started to happen, and it happened for me in Boston. And what happened, the short version is I started teaching jazz history at Tufts University, and then they expanded my duties. They liked me, you know, and the students liked me. And the chair of the department at that time was an African-American composer named T.J. Anderson. In fact, it was a known thing that he was the first African-American to be the chair of a music department other than at a historically black college. Unless he was the first one to be the chair of anything. I know that he was the first and that it was listed, you know, he was known for that. Anyway, he became my mentor. TJ is a great guy. To this day, we're in touch, you know, and thank God he uses email so we can be in touch. He's in his 80s now. He's retired, lives in the vicinity of Duke University. And he's the one who said to me, he said, you know, you really have a talent for teaching. The students like you. it was supposed to be just one semester in January '77. It was supposed to be kind of a one semester contract, and then we'll get someone else. And he said, I'd like to keep you around, and I think you should consider getting a graduate degree. And I actually said to him, I don't want to. I said, I don't feel like going back to school. And I really resisted, and he laughs to this day because he really had to fight to convince me. And finally, I did it in stages. I got a master's in music theory working with him and the other faculty at Tufts while I was teaching there. And then by that time, they expanded my duties. I was the first jazz band director at Tufts University. And I was teaching intro to jazz. I was teaching basic theory. And then TJ insisted I should go on for my doctorate. And I didn't want to, but I said, well, all right. I finally gave in, and I wanted to stay in the area because I had a gig, I had it wasn't full-time, but it was a substantial part-time, like something like 2/3 time, you could say. And I applied to schools in the area, and the one I decided to go to was Brandeis. And part of the reason for that is that they said to me, as a teaching position, while you're here to help support you, we're going to give you free tuition, plus we're going to hire you to start a jazz band at Brandeis. So I actually was the first jazz band director at Tufts and Brandeis. The only difference being that at Tufts they had a student band, but they asked to have a faculty director so they could become official. So I came into a student band that was already doing kind of Glenn Miller and stuff like that, and I kind of said, why don't we do some Thad Jones and some more demanding and interesting stuff. And at Brandeis, they had no band. So the difference there is I actually tacked up signs on bulletin boards and said, I'm holding auditions for a jazz band. I did it all from scratch. Wow. Both of the bands, of course, are still going on to this day.
Wow, yeah. So you built the program there from scratch pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. And so that was my legacy in Boston, and that's how I became very involved in jazz education at the same time as continuing to work as a performer. The downside for me throughout the 80s and 90s is that I found it was extremely hard to maintain a performance career or even to find enough time to practice while getting a PhD, directing all these bands, so forth and so on. I eventually gave up the Brandeis band, I think it was in '85, and in order to just concentrate on what I was doing, I think it was '84, in order to just concentrate on Tufts, because by that time Tufts had hired me full-time, and it was a lot of work. And then in '86 I got hired at Rutgers in Newark, where I've been ever since. But it's a lot of work, and so it's actually only in recent years that I really am feeling good about my playing again, And in fact, I feel better now than I ever have about my playing. I really feel like I'm very self-critical, but I finally feel like I want people to hear what I'm doing.
That's great. Yeah, I've seen this with music. I mean, to be an amazing performer, to be like really high level performer, you really need to put in hours and hours of a day of practice and dedication towards your craft. And sometimes it's challenging because there's so many great things that we would want to do in this life. It's too bad we don't live another 100 years because we have a few different careers. But it's really great that you were able to balance the two and continue to play piano and keep it up, and also play saxophone and make gigs.
Well, what happened to me was I had to make some hard choices. So you're right. It's a very difficult thing, and you have to find the balance. So what happened to me is in the 80s, I would play sax and piano at gigs, sometimes both. Sometimes I would do gigs. For a while I was doing gigs without piano, but with guitar, so that on some tunes I could sit at the piano and play. And then for a while I even tried doing gigs with two bass players and no other chord instrument. So it would be like myself on sax, switching around between sax and piano, two bass players and a drummer, which actually was kind of fun. I kind of loved that, being a bass player yourself. Sometimes it's fun when there's two bass players. And
you can do switches. And
if you find the right two bass players and they work well. There was a bass player I played with once when I was a guest artist at North Texas in '87. And one of the bass players is Nathan Berg, who's the son of Chuck Berg. And he was in New York for a while. I don't know if he's still around here, but he's a terrific player. I mean, he was just great. And so he would do kind of the Scott LaForest stuff, and the other guy was kind of holding it down, and that really felt good, you know. So, but I was also, by that time, I was married. My son was born in 87. My daughter was born in 91. I'm a very devoted parent, so I was spending, a lot of my life. I still do, with now they're in their 20s. I still spend a lot of time with them. And I just could not possibly practice enough on the saxophone and the piano. And this is the big thing, do my educational publications. Because what happened is by this time, I liked writing educational publications for musicians. I mean, I almost feel apologetic for it because today I can't imagine sitting down and trying to, get another big publication like that done. I mean, it's all-consuming,
Yeah, very time consuming. But there's definitely a reward there. I mean, you've written some major publications, especially, for example, the books on Lester Young. Tell us a little bit about how that came about and the research behind that, and talk to us a little bit about working on such a monumental project.
Well, it's funny. My whole career was really a total fluke. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I had like no plan, whatever. And so with the teaching thing, I mentioned that T.J. Anderson, who thank God is still around. It was T.J. Anderson that said you should really teach. You've got a talent. You've got the right, not just a talent for teaching, but you're knowledgeable and the whole package. He thought was good. And it was TJ who convinced me I should be a teacher. I never even thought of that. It was TJ who convinced me to go for a doctorate. I not only didn't think of it, I fought him tooth and nail.
Yeah.
Poor TJ. He had to stay after me. It was really almost a year before he finally convinced me to do that. And but the other thing is that he kind of had his eyes out to help me, and I didn't even realize what he was doing for me. So one day I went up to him and I said, in order to teach this jazz history course here, I've written to the publishers. Today you can do it all online, but I've written to the publishers and say, please send me your jazz history textbooks. I'd like to see what's out there and pick the best one. He said, and? I said, they all stink. I said, I can't find one that I think. I said, I know jazz history just because by that point I'd listened probably for thousands of hours,
Yeah.
It's just the kind of person I am. I used to go to the library and take out, I used to say, what's the maximum number of LPs you could take out? And if they said 12, I used to take out 12. And it was not only jazz, but it was mostly jazz, also a lot of classical. Later on, world music, Indian music in particular. But I said, I just know this is not right. These don't make sense. And I said, I'm even making these notes. And I showed him. I said, I have all these notes. He said, you're making notes on the textbooks? I said, yeah, there's 3, 4, 5 of them. He said, why don't you write those up and send it into this journal? I said, what? What do you want me to do? Write up your notes and send it to the Black Perspective in Music. All right, if you want me to. I was such an idiot. I didn't realize he was looking out for me. Because what happened is the first thing I ever published in 1978 was this review essay comparing jazz history textbooks. And I compared, I think, 4 different textbooks. Of course, I concluded they all stunk, but I had a lot of details. On page 5, he says this. On page 20, he says that. Why is this wrong? Why is that wrong? And from that one publication, the phone started to ring.
Wow. Yeah. So he really hooked you up,
He really connected me, thanks to TJ. I had no idea why he even said to send it in. I said, who wants to read that? What happened? First, the editor of that journal called me, Eileen Southern. The late Eileen Southern was a brilliant lady, an African-American scholar, and Dr. Southern. She called me and said, I was very pleased to publish your review essay, and I'm getting a lot of response to it, positive response. I said, oh, that's nice. She said, would you like to be an editor of the journal? I said, really? You want me to be an editor? She said, well, to tell you the truth, it's called the Black Perspective in Music. I don't have any editors who aren't black. but she said, "You're so knowledgeable, I'd like to include you as an editor." So it's quite a compliment. And she became a mentor too. She was a great person, you know. Then, I swear, I got another phone call. "Hello, this is Martin Williams from the Smithsonian Institution." Now, Martin, before he was with the Smithsonian, was one of the best-known writers on jazz. He was a critic, jazz critic. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Williams, what do I owe this call to?" In fact, I remember he called me. He didn't have my home phone, so he called me at Tufts, and I was in the music library. And someone came over and said, "There's a call for you." "All right, I'll take it." He said, "Well," he said, "I read your review essay, and I'd like to hire you to write some liner notes and essays and things like that for various Smithsonian publications." Okay, great. The phone rang again, just from the same essay. "Book publisher, what can I do for you?" I noticed at the end of the review essay, it had a little byline. It said, "Lewis Porter is doing a master's thesis on Lester Young as part of my master's in music theory that I was working on with T.J. Anderson." This is before the doctorate. And they said, "Are you looking to publish that as a book?" I said, "Well, I mean, it's not even done yet. I wasn't even thinking about that, but I guess that would
Wow.
be,
Yeah.
we should talk about it." All this because TJ told me to write that review essay. And the truth is, from that day to this, I've never had to look for opportunities to publish. And I feel bad for all the academics, like, "Oh my God, where can I publish?" I mostly have turned down because I got so many requests to publish things that I probably turned down more than I accepted. But anytime I turn something down to this day, I say, "But you should ask so-and-so." So the truth is, there are a lot of books out there. If you look at the preface, it says, "Thanks to Lewis Porter, who recommended me to do this."
Yeah.
So, you know, I do like to spread it around. But that started me, and that thesis on Lester Young became my first book. The second book was because Martin Williams called me again, and he said, "I'd like you to do an anthology about Lester Young." He said, in fact, I don't know if you realize this, but it'll be the first time an anthology was ever done on a jazz musician. He said, "I want to do it to kind of show them that it doesn't have to be a Bach reader or a Beethoven reader. It could be a Lester Young reader." All right, great. And by that time, I was at Brandeis, and I knew when I applied for PhD programs, after I had done Prez, I knew the next step was to do Coltrane. And I actually said, when I applied, I said, I should mention, and I said, "I know that it's better to be flexible and you should see what the faculty like, but I should mention that I feel a little stubborn. I know I want to do Coltrane for my PhD dissertation, and if that's not something possible here, I probably shouldn't even apply." I was that blunt.
Wow. Yeah.
And believe it or not, some schools said no. Yale said no. Wesleyan said no. See, today they wouldn't, but in those days they weren't interested. Harvard said probably not. They had to think about it. And then when I published one chapter of it as an article on Coltrane, the Harvard faculty happened to be at that talk. All the Harvard faculty. It was kind of amazing. And one of them, Christoph Wolff, who's a brilliant Bach scholar, came up to me and he said, "If I had known that this was the kind of research you were going to do, we would have had a different attitude. But we couldn't imagine what it meant at that time to do jazz research, you know."
Sure.
They didn't take it seriously, you know. And Brandeis was the most enthusiastic, and they had this opportunity to start a big band there. So the Coltrane book, I guess to this day, you'd say in Latin, you'd call that my magnum opus. You know, that's the one that is took me the most time and that I really put so much work into, you know. And once that book was done, slowly but surely, I've rearranged my life to make time to practice, frankly, you know.
Sure.
I gave up the sax. I said, I just cannot practice sax and piano every day. And the piano was first for me. You know, I was doing that since a fairly early age.
So you really focused on back on the piano,
Yep.
and wow, it's really amazing. I mean, I've been told by many people, and I certainly agree with it, that you're the greatest jazz researcher on the planet.
Well, I don't know
you
about that.
really do quite a thorough job of your research, and you have some great books that you've written, and they touch on some really interesting topics.
Well, that's nice of you. I appreciate it.
You know, but the interesting part about it is that, you know, your analysis of the history books and, you know, your pre-knowledge that wow, these books are not written that well, and your critique of them must have really helped your writing and the way that you looked at writing books, because you must have written your books in a very correct way, so to speak, because a lot
Yeah.
of the books are written, in such a way where they didn't check sources or they didn't do things that, nowadays with your jazz
Yeah.
historiography we take for granted.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that drove me crazy then and still does about a lot of things people write about jazz is sometimes they just don't make sense. In other words, it's bad enough with the dates are wrong, the names are wrong. Okay, we'll live with that. And I think things are getting better in that respect. But sometimes it's just they say things that don't make sense. And you go, well, even if without doing any research, that just doesn't make sense because we're musicians and we know how things happen in the music world.
Sure.
So that's not the way things happen. So for this is a kind of funny little example, but I think I saw this in some liner notes somewhere. It said during the first 3 months of 1957, it's evident that Coltrane was depressed because he didn't do any recording. Well, see, that defies common sense because Coltrane wasn't recording as a leader at that time. His first album as a leader was in May 1957. When you're not recording as a leader, it's not up to you when you make recordings. Duh.
Sure.
If someone calls you, you make a record as a side person. If someone doesn't call you, you don't. So you can't tell anything whether he was depressed or not depressed from whether somebody called him that month to do a date. That's just total randomness. It's just a total fluke. So that's a funny little example of the kind of things they got wrong. And they may be small things, but they would drive me crazy. As far as writing, I will say this. I don't consider myself a great writer in terms of style, though people have told me that it's clear and easy to comprehend, and if that's true, I'm grateful. But I appreciate great style. Like when I read F. Scott Fitzgerald, I'm always like blown away.
Sure.
Dickens, by the way, is an amazing writer. When I read Dickens, I'm like astounded just the ways he finds to say things, and to describe things. And I have examples of writers' work. Like, I mean, if I ever did a thing on literature, I'd have examples that I think are great examples of writing. I could learn from those, and I think I have some over the years. I think I write better than I used to, but I've never really been, and this is where I think people misunderstand me. Maybe this is a good place to set this straight. I've never really had the self-image that I'm a writer. What I am is a musician who has things to say about music. And if I really have to say them enough, I'll put them down in print. But a writer is someone who loves to write, and who, if you say to that person, "Ooh, I have a great idea of something you could write," they go, "Ooh, thank you. I was looking for something to write." That's not me. That's why I turned down so many writing opportunities. If I'm, driven to write something, I'll write it. But at this point in time, frankly, I don't have time for that because at this point in time, I'm really busy practicing the piano. I have a lot of very specific goals. And one of the interesting things is the way my life went, the way my career went, because I turned down piano lessons because I didn't like my older brother's piano teacher. To this point in time, I've had lessons here and there. I haven't even had continuous lessons. To this point in time, I tell people I've had about 3 years of lessons. But even that, I'm really talking about, spread over, 30 years of my life, and it's one lesson here. I don't even know how you can call it 3 years, but I'm just kind of, for example, I took my friend Andy Laverne is a great teacher. He's really a marvelous teacher. And I took, I would say, 6 to 8 lessons with Andy about once every 2 months. Does that count as a year of lessons if you're taking them one every 2 months? How do you really count that?
Yeah, how do you count it, and how do you count the hours? And also, the human mind is interesting. You have to do the repetitive motions or it goes away. You have to maintain it. And, it's really great that you have like a sort of second opportunity now that your kids are, in their 20s and out of school. You can kind of focus your energy back towards working hard at the piano.
Exactly. And one thing I'll give myself credit for is I do practice very hard. If I take a lesson with somebody, I'll I'll really pick their brain. And I have gone to some of the gurus. I took one lesson with Sophia Rosoff, who's the teacher of Fred Hirsch, and my friend Ethan Iverson, Iverson's good buddy and a great person. I took one lesson with her. I took one lesson with Edna Golansky, who's brilliant, and she's the teacher of Danilo Perez. Of course, both of them have classical students too. I took one lesson with my friend Steve Kuhn, who lives not far from me. And
What about Sherlock? Who's the woman in
the
Boston?
Madame Shaloff. I never
Yeah,
did
Shaloff,
get to meet
yeah.
her, although I met one of her sons, who was the famous Serge Chaloff died. He was a drug addict, but she has another son who was alive 20 years ago, who I got to meet actually.
Interesting.
And I've even gone. I've been using good decisions as far as when I go for a lesson, who do I go to? And the bottom line is, I guess you could say I'm mostly self-taught, but I know how to. When I need some information, I know where to go, and then I practice like the Dickens for hours and hours a day. And the good news is, I guess I'm doing something right because cats have been calling me.
Sure.
I've done a lot of work in Europe. I'm a sideman on a bunch of recordings. And I've had a few things as a leader, but I'm so self-critical, I won't even let anybody hear the old ones as a leader, even though I have a box of one of them. They're going to go in the trash someday. But I do have a new one as a leader that I feel very good about.
Wow. Yeah. So, tell us a little bit about that record that you just came out with.
Well, there's this little label called Unseen Rain. And I should ask them what that comes from. It's kind of interesting. It's like it's raining, but you can't see it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're a small independent label. One of the owners of the label is a very fine musician himself. His name is Jack DeSalvo. He's a guitarist who toured with Ronald Shannon Jackson in the 80s. And he's also a composer, a great guy. And I had recorded a couple of albums for that label as a side person. The leader was a saxophonist named Chris Kelsey. Chris is terrific. He's a kind of a free jazz player, a very imaginative composer. And Jack was the producer and played on one of those albums, played guitar as well. And he came up to me and he said, "What do you have out as a leader?" I said, "Nothing. The last one was 2006 or something." Which was live in Italy, by the way, with a great bassist who's well known in Europe, Furio de Castri. But my playing has changed so much in the years since then, I couldn't, in good faith, say to people that represents how I play. He said, "Well, you need something as a leader." So I really thank Jack because he produced it, let me do whatever I wanted, and what I chose to do is to play standards with Joris Tepper on bass and Rudy Royston on drums. These are my first call buddies.
Great bassist,
Yeah.
the Groningen Conservatory,
Yeah, exactly. Yep, he runs a program there, and they're both great guys, good friends of mine. I love playing with them. I did standards with them, and then free improvisations on solo piano, and the album is interspersing them. And I'm getting very good response to it already. It's only been out about a week as of this interview, but I especially wish that people who only heard me years ago would listen to this, because the only drag that I have, my career is, everything's going great. The only drag that I have is that there are people who heard me, the last time they heard me was 25 years ago when I was raising my kids and trying to work at saxophone and piano and write books, and didn't have time to practice and wasn't really, in my judgment, wasn't really cutting it, And the funny thing is, if you can believe that some of these people who at least claim to be friends of mine can't take 5 minutes to go on YouTube, where I have a channel. I'm going to mention that the channel is LRP Jazz. It should be easy to find.
Yeah.
Can't go to YouTube and spend 5 minutes saying, "I wonder what Louis Porter sounds like these days," So even better would be, of course, if they would listen to the new album. But one thing I've learned is that those are not my friends. A friend of yours will take 5 minutes to listen.
Check out your stuff.
Yeah, for 5 minutes. I mean, I get practically once a week, I'll get an email from someone who I'm not familiar with. And it may not be a personal email. Maybe it's a blast that they're sending to a lot of people who say, "I'd love for you to hear my new album." guess what? I'll click on the link and I'll listen to it for 5 minutes. It's not going to kill you. Curious to hear what people are doing, you know. So if you won't listen to somebody that's supposed to be a friend of yours, probably they're not really your friends. But I do feel good about it. I mean, like you and like every other musician, I have a long list of things that I'm working on. In fact, I literally have a list. I'll show it to you if you want. It's actually taped to the piano.
Yeah, there's like hundreds of things you can have, you know, same thing with bass, you know, there's just so many things that one might have to work through and it's just never ending.
Exactly. I mean, it's really never ending. So it's not, I'm not going to say that I've arrived somewhere that I'm going to stay. In fact, there are already, uh, it's funny, on the album, the trio stuff with the standards, one of the things we do is Cherokee, one of the things we do is a blues and F. I mean, there's nothing more standard. That's as standard can get. And that was recorded in January of this year, 2013. And you know, even since then, on both the blues and on Cherokee, I've come up with different approaches that I hadn't thought of then. So, you know, that's one of the great things about music. That's one of the things that we love about it. You know,
It's evolving.
yeah, there's always more you can do. There's always a different approach. There's always a technical threshold that you can break through, but also conceptually, there's something that you can do that's different than what you did before. Different way. Bitonality is one of the things I like to do. You know, different things in terms of approaching the changes, breaking things up rhythmically a different way. So that's what's happening with that. And the other thing is, all my life, you know, when I was 10, I decided I wanted to be a musician, but at that time I was thinking classical musician. And all my life I've listened hard to classical music. I have a huge music library, which I'll show you before you go.
We have to take a look.
Yeah, I have a huge music library. Some people joke when they look around and go, "Wow, we'll call this the Little Institute of Jazz Studies," you know. And
Blues Institute.
Yeah, Blues Institute. But what people don't notice until they look closely is about a third of my library is classical recordings and classical scores. I have probably about 1,000 classical scores, if not more. So I have always been interested in writing classical music, and in fact, when I was at University of Rochester, I did study 3 semesters classical composition, 2 with David Russell Williams, who's not well known, but is a great person, great teacher, and 1 with Samuel Adler, who's actually a very well-known classical teacher. And so I finally started writing, and I got a few big pieces already completed. One is a concerto for my friend Dave Liebman and orchestra, which was performed by a student orchestra at Harvard. All 3 movements are online. It's about 20 minutes of music. One is a piece for string quartet, and my friend, fellow pianist Don Friedman, is a good buddy of mine, and obviously he's a famous jazz piano player. Anybody can Google him and they'll see some of the stuff he's done. You know, Scott LaFar, Eric Dolphy, Booker Little, Charles Lloyd, Clark Terry, you name it. And we performed that on campus at Rutgers, and that's a couple of movements of that are up. That's about an hour, with a lot of very intense string writing. It's not, you know, one thing, my pet peeves is people who think that strings are only good for slow-moving backgrounds. I gave these strings a lot of work. They're hard working on this piece. And I'm just about done with a piece for a concerto for classical saxophone. He's a great player named Paul Cohn. He's one of the people that, along with Dave Dempsey, that when New York Philharmonic needs a saxophone for Ravel or something like that, they'll call Dave Dempsey or Paul Cohn.
Sure.
And this piece is just about done. I'm just actually polishing up some of the orchestration because that's for classical saxophone and wind ensemble. And so that's another thing I'm doing is working on big compositions. But my main focus is playing the piano. The composing I love, but I'm going to say that's a second focus. My main one is playing the piano and working hard to reach more of my goals at that.
Yeah, so you know that's really great, and let's talk a little bit about some of the people you've worked with over the years, because we talked a little bit about your recent times, but I want to talk about some of the great musicians you worked with, because you worked with some of the top cats around the globe.
It's funny, some of the people that I've worked with, you know, things happen in life, you never know sometimes where you're going to end up with. So, for example, in 1974, I'm pretty sure it was, but it could have been 72, there was a jazz museum around 54th Street in Midtown Manhattan that was only in existence for a few years in the 70s. Now there's a jazz museum in Harlem. But this one was in Midtown. And I wish I could even remember how this happened, but somehow I got a call from the drummer Al Dreers. Now, Al had played with Prez, and he said, I have a concert at the Jazz Museum, and the piano player is Larry Willis, who's a great player, but he can only make the second set. I'd like you to make the first set. And it was a paying gig, not that much, but it paid something. And so I went down. Turned out it was Al Dreers on drums, myself piano, Calvin Hill on bass, who later was touring with McCoy, maybe around this time. Yeah. And Paul Quinichette. Now, isn't that interesting? Because this was before I was writing about Prez, but Paul Quinichette was known as the Vice Prez. And it was so great that I got to play with him, and he was a funny guy. And so that was really a great experience, even if it was just for one set. I remember we did These Foolish Things, and I'm sure we did a blues. I'm not sure if I can remember the whole set list, but that was great. Now, Al also hired me to do a private party. Just to give you an example, who does private parties? Again, Calvin Hill on bass, myself piano, Al Dreers, and David Schnitter on tenor sax.
Wow.
Who I think this was before he was with Blakey, but it could be, maybe he was already with Blakey. I'd have to look that up. So, we were doing a private party. What are you going to do? We all needed the gig. You know how it is,
Well, if you're going to do a private party, who better to do it with than, some of the top cats.
Exactly. Around 1986, I did a private party in Connecticut, and it was Art Barron on trombone. It was my good friend Matt Glazer on violin, who is the founder of the jazz string program at Berklee College, and now the founder of their some kind of a world music program that he's running there. And I'm not sure if I can remember everyone who was in the band, but that was another one, like an all-star band playing at a wedding.
Sure.
And in between about 1980 and 86, I had the particular good fortune to do at least maybe 5-6 times a year to perform at the late Alan Dawson. Wow, Alan was a great drummer. He was a very nice person, and of course, a legendary teacher of drummers. But I knew him just as a very nice cat who of course, I knew who he was. I knew that he'd played with Clifford Brown when he was in Lionel Hampton's band. He'd done a lot of amazing things. Excuse me. And we had various bass players. Usually it was Whit Brown on the bass. So that was a great trio. I had a lot of fun working with them. And I have, over the years, I like to play free and I like to play standards. I like to do everything. So I've done an occasional gig in the late 80s. I did some gigs with Greg Bendian, who's a drummer composer in the free jazz vein, also works in fusion. He has a band that does Mahavishnu music.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And he introduced me to Mark Rebo, who, of course, is a great guitar player. We did a gig with Mark where we played only tunes of Dolphy. Wow, that was a great one. And Mark played all those heads, which are not easy heads, that was great. And I played alto sax on that, which was appropriate because it was a Dolphy gig. And I remember doing another gig of Dolphy music with Mark Dresser on bass and Jerry Hemingway on drums. Jerry's great, Mark, of course, terrific. And my good friend Tom Varner was on French horn. And in recent years, I've done an occasional concert with Dave Liebman. We've become friends over the years. Such good friends that Dave asked me to be his co-author for his autobiography book, which came out in March of 2012. And I'm also on the latest Dave Liebman album, which came out in November 2012 on the Angel label. And it was my idea to bring Mark Rebo to that album. So see, everything comes full circle because Mark and I had stayed in touch. And Dave said, I want to make an album with you, but we have to find something different, because he does a lot of recording and he didn't want it to be just another Dave Liebman album. It turned out to be a fun idea. It was a fun combination, and the album's getting good reviews.
That's really great.
It's called Surreality on the Angel label. And in recent years, I've been getting a lot of calls to work as a side person. In fact, I would say I do more work these days as a side person than as a leader. Wycliffe Gordon calls me on occasion, usually when he has a big group, but we also have done small groups. Like we did a quartet gig at William Patterson University a few years ago. I get calls from Chris Kelsey, who I mentioned, for free improvisation things. I've done free improvisation things with Daniel Carter, with Matt Lavelle.
Explored some Indian stuff as well, right?
And that's thanks for bringing that up, because I do so many things I forget. But I'm a co-leader of several different situations involving Indian music. One is a group called Dharma Jazz, which features the fantastic Badal Roy on tablas. He's also a very funny guy. He's a lot of fun to work with. And fabulous Freddie Bryant is on guitar, and our friend Carter Kay is on additional percussion. That's called Dharma Jazz. I'm in a duo, but sometimes it's a bigger group, with an Indian sitarist whose name is Gargi Shinde. And it looks like we'll be doing something this fall with a larger group. I'm also in a group with a saxophonist based in Boston whose name is Phil Scarf, and we do Indian music and jazz. Now, that group, the instrumentation looks like a jazz band, because it's myself piano, Phil on saxes, and bass and drums. Great bassist and drummer, John Funkhauser and Bertram Lehman. But what people don't know, or might not realize at first, is that Phil is an expert on playing Indian music on soprano sax. And believe it or not, he's so good at it that he has studied in India for months every year. He goes to India, and he is so good at it that he actually gives concerts in India for Indian audiences.
Wow.
So I'm telling you, if you think you know Indian music, try playing for Indian audiences. You'll be out of
you gotta be in another level to do that.
Very few people can play for an Indian audience. So he's really top notch at that stuff. And so that's a group, Lewis Porter, Phil Scarf Quartet, and we have performed in the Boston area. We also do an occasional concert at the campus in Rutgers. We have a concert coming up in Boston area this summer. So that's the Indian music. I'm interested in world music generally, but I would say of world music context, Indian is the one that, for whatever reason, I've been most involved with. I've always loved it. I don't even remember how I got interested in Indian music, but I must have been into it pretty young, because for 1 year I lived in San Francisco area. That was right after college, 72, 73. And do you know, I can't even remember why, but one of the first things I did was I went to the phone and I called the Ali Akbar Khan School of Music. Ali Akbar Khan is a very famous Indian sarod player, North Indian sarod player, which is a kind of a lute type instrument as opposed to a sitar.
Sure.
Though he had worked in situations with Ravi Shankar on sitar. And I called them and said, I play keyboards and piano, and I'd like to play Indian music with people from the Ali Akbar Khan School. I was only talking to a receptionist. I didn't even know how I expected to get a response. Sure enough, I got calls from faculty members, and we ended up forming a group called the Indian Improvisation Ensemble that performed all over the San Francisco area. So Indian music has been
You've been doing it a long time.
A long time, and I don't remember how I got interested in it. I assume I just heard recordings. I think some of the first that I heard were the ones that the late Yehudi Menuhin did with the late Ravi Shankar, combining classical music and Indian music. So that's one. So it's kind of hard, I mean, in terms of the whole picture of what I'm doing. It's free improvisations with Chris Kelsey and others, Joe Gallant on bass, great players, and Jack DeSalvo himself on guitar. It's standards with any number of people, modern standards, I guess you would call what I do with Dave Liebman and folks like that. And it's Indian music with several different groups. And I also work in a group with a very fine singer named Steve Kaiser. He's an excellent singer. I like to tell people he's in a Tony Bennett mode just to give them a taste of it, but he's really his own person, and he's also a bassist. He plays very fine bass while I play piano, and Kevin Golden plays guitar. So I'm a side person in a bunch of different bands, and I'm happy doing that, you know.
Wow, so that's really great. Let's talk a little bit about Rutgers and your founding of one of the most unique and great programs in the country, you know, the Jazz History and Research Program for master's students.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's, of course, a great pleasure to have you in the program. And what happened is I was teaching at Tufts, and I got a call from Dan Morgenstern in January, possibly February of 1986, and he said, we barely knew each other at that point. We just knew each other professionally. And he said, did you know there's a job opening at Rutgers? I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, you want me to send you the announcement? I mean, you should look at it, because this is before the internet. So he sent me the announcement. I decided to apply. The short story is I got the job, but at that time the job was to teach general undergraduate courses. I took it because I wanted to be back in the general tri-state area, and I thought, well, there's a potential future there to do more jazz. When I first took the job, it wasn't a jazz job. It was to teach intro to music, sometimes jazz history, maybe once a year, fundamentals of music, which is for people who are just learning to read and write music.
Sure.
And but I saw the potential. You know, the nice thing about academia is there's a lot of flexibility in terms of kind of tailoring a job to fit you. You know, you can say to someone else in the department, you know, I don't feel like teaching fundamentals this year. Would you mind doing it? Sure, why not? I'd like to introduce a course. So I introduced a course called Music and Film. Now, I do a version of that now for the graduate students called Jazz and Film. So eventually I tailored things, and finally in 1997 I got the permission to start a master's program in jazz history and research. To this day, it's the only jazz history degree in the world. So it's a unique program. And what I love about it is that I get to teach people like you know, smart people who are players, who are musicians. And it's such an interesting mix of people. As you know, for being in the program, it's incredible because there are people like yourself who are straight out of an undergraduate jazz program, in your case, William Patterson. There are people who are just finished with an undergraduate degree, not in jazz. Maybe they were a psych major like me, or we've had philosophy majors, history majors, but they're players, they're musicians, they can pass our music theory requirements, but they're not performers per se. They're not really headed for a performance career, but they would do well as historians, researchers, analysis, music theory. They can transcribe. Sometimes people are good at those things, but they're not really, you know, performers in that sense. But we also get people who are going back to school. We have people who are amateur musicians who decided to come back to school. We had a great guy who was a very accomplished dean in the sciences at Rutgers named Louis Iazzi, and he had maintained a hobby of playing jazz saxophone all his life, came back to school, did a great job in the program. And we also have well-known musicians who come back to school to study with us. So for example, the bassist Ratso Harris got a master's degree with us. Kenny Berger, who's a terrific baritone sax player, got a degree with us. Vincent Gardner, who to my mind is one of the best jazz trombonists anywhere, just finished his master's degree with us just a month ago. And Rhoda Scott, the legendary organist, is in school with us. Melba Joyce, the singer, is just about done with her degree. So it's a fantastic mix. I'm sure you'll agree with me.
Yeah. I mean,
great
it's really
mix of people from what I call all walks of the jazz life. They could be young, they could be old, they could be well-known, they could be not well-known, they could be performers, they could be more musically literate but not performers. But it is a program for musicians. To get the degree, you do have to pass a certain amount of music theory. You have to do some transcribing, things like that.
Well, you know, I really appreciate your compliments, but yeah, the program is great. I mean, there's such a wide variety of people in the program, and it is the only program in the world where you can get a master's degree in jazz history and research. And it's quite interesting, the kind of topics that we explore and talk about. You know, it's cool that you single-handedly pretty much founded the program, and also at the same time you started a journal, right? You were editor of a journal at the same time.
There's a long story to that, but the short version is that around 2007, you could look it up, I can't even remember exactly, but I founded a journal called Jazz Perspectives, and I asked one of my colleagues who teaches with me, John Howland, and I asked John to co-edit and co-found the journal because I knew I couldn't do it myself, on top of which John is a marvelous editor and a great guy. So we started Jazz Perspectives, put together a very distinguished international board, and that was the first what they called peer-reviewed English language jazz journal. And the long and short of it is, I didn't even realize how needed it was. I thought, well, all right, this is going to be a lot of work, but we'll do it. It turns out there was a desperate need for it because they're peer-reviewed. Our viewers can look that up, but that's something that you need in order for a journal to have a certain kind of respect. Is what that means is that nothing gets into that journal just because the editor likes you or even likes your article. It has to be reviewed anonymously by distinguished people in the field, and they have to say, you know what, this is worth publishing.
Sure.
So what happens is that automatically ups the reputation of the journal. And the bottom line is, at this point in time, I was able to leave the journal after the first 3 years with a optimistic feeling, because there's a long waiting list of people who want to publish in the journal. It's well established now, and it's doing great.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Journal.
And as far as my colleagues, I should mention John Howland, who is a great jazz historian and a real deep Ellington scholar, but also James P. Johnson, and he's doing research on jazz with strings and all kinds of interesting things. He's currently on leave and teaching in Norway. We're hoping we'll see him back. And my other colleague is Henry Martin. Henry's a very distinguished jazz theorist and analyst. He's published about analysis of Charlie Parker. One of his first things he ever published was analysis of Chick Corea's solo. And he's always got interesting things to contribute to the program.
Well, it's really quite a unique program, and for anyone watching this, how can they find out about the program and apply?
I don't know a short link by memory, but if you just Google Jazz MA Rutgers, it pops right up, because the performance program, which is also a great program at the other campus, is an MM degree. There's only one Jazz MA degree. So that pops right up. Another way to do it is to go to lewisporter.com, and there's a link right from there to the program. And people who want to keep in touch with what I'm doing, lewisporter.com is fine. I also have an emailing list for if people want to be emailed when I have a performance in the New York area. I have a separate emailing list for people in the Boston area and for people in Philadelphia area. And I'm very easily reachable through lewisporter.com. I would say that if you want to friend me on Facebook, that's more up to date. Facebook, you're constantly putting what you're doing that day, but I'm going to try and be more keeping my lewisporter.com more up to date. And I also have a video channel on YouTube, which is LRP Jazz, but there are also a lot of videos on YouTube that I didn't put up. So, for example, there's an organization called Philoctetes, believe it or not, that put up, each video is 90 minutes, and they're performances and demonstration, performance and talk that I did with a bunch of friends of mine: Bella Fleck, Don Byron, Jane Ira Bloom, David King, the drummer from The Bad Plus. You'll see a lot of my friends up there. Andy Stein, who's a great violinist. I can't even think of them all right now. Greg Wall is an amazing saxophone player, and a rabbi. He's a really interesting cat. So there are a lot of things up on YouTube that aren't on my channel, but my channel is LRP Jazz.
So just before we finish up, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, the broader aspect of things. I want to ask you, for a budding researcher or someone who's interested in working on jazz and getting involved in jazz history and research, what advice could you give to them? Big themed advice.
Well, that's a big one. First of all, you know that I have a bias, which is that it's ideal if someone who's doing research on music is musically literate. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole argument if someone's not a musician, Can they say something worthwhile about music? The bottom line is there are certain things you'll never know if you don't play an instrument and have some knowledge of music notation. And you can call that a bias. That's my bias. And the important thing, though, is it doesn't, we have people right here in the program who are not performers. They're not out there gigging, but they have great things to say about the music. And we know from class discussions, sometimes they have very precise insights that require a knowledge of music to say them. So the point is, it doesn't matter how good you are, just the fact that you're struggling with an instrument gives you insights into the music and helps you to have a sense of what's involved for the people who really are great at playing music. So that's one thing. And the other thing is knowing some basic resources. So for example, all of my students know about the Darmstadt Jazz Institute, which in Darmstadt, Germany, which has a website that has a service where they'll send you a bibliography on any topic for free. Great place to start. There have been a number of very good discographies in jazz, but it's become standard now that the standard one is Tom Lord's Jazz Discography. That's a resource that anybody who's doing research should know about.
Well, thanks for that. And let me ask you overall, if you have advice for young musicians who are watching this and interested in music, give us some pieces of advice you would have for someone who's getting started playing and wants to live this life of jazz and possibly research, or
right.
You have it.
Well, I don't, my own career was such a haphazard mess that it's funny. It's like I didn't plan anything out. And so I guess one of the things that I would say is to be open to the different avenues that may come your way, because you really never know where your career is going to lead to. I mean, things are so random how things happen sometimes, but very often it's a good thing, and it's great how things happen, and that's one of the great things about the jazz life. One thing I will say for anyone who's interested in being in the jazz world is that I love the jazz world. I mean, in my experience, jazz people are smart people. They're almost without exception liberal-minded people. We almost all vote Democrat. Now, I'll bet 98% of jazz musicians voted for Obama, and that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. And they're smart, interesting people, and of course, they're in the arts, which is a certain kind of person. And so it's a great community. And one of the things I love about the jazz community is it's big enough that you're always meeting somebody new, but it's small enough that you don't feel overwhelmed. Like people do know, word spreads quick. If somebody's in trouble or somebody's ill, somebody passes away, the word spreads quickly, and there is a feeling of community. It's not too big to have that feeling. So I love that about it.
Well, that's really some great insight. And Dr. Porter, thanks so much for doing this interview. There's so much that we weren't able to talk about, but maybe in future we'll do some more discussions and interviews. There's such great stuff you wrote in the Coltrane biography and the Liebman biography and Lester Young, and I'd like to discuss that at some point. So
it'll be a pleasure. You do a great interview. You've got a great series online, and I'm pleased to be part of it.
Well, thanks. And we'll stay tuned, cats, because we're going to do some more.
Sounds good.